Hello, and welcome to Out in Space, the podcast for LGBT astronomers and allies. I am Vlad. I'm an assistant professor of astronomy at an MSU, and I am bisexual.
I'm Cass. I'm a Winton Fellow in Theoretical Astrophysics and Exoplanets at the University of Leicester, and I'm gay.
I'm Alex Ticci. I'm a graduate student at Columbia University, and I'm gay.
I'm Jody Burtis. I am a graduate student at New Mexico State University, and I'm gay.
Alrighty. So thank you all for joining us today on Out in Space. Our guest is Dr. Carolyn Brinkworth. Carolyn has a PhD in astrophysics from the University of Southampton, and since then has had an impressively diverse career path. She has held multiple positions at the Infrared Processing and Analysis Center at the California Institute of Technology, including as a staff scientist supporting NASA's Spitzer Space Telescope and the NASA Exoplanet Science Institute, and as deputy lead for public affairs. In 2014, she became the Director of Diversity, Education, and Outreach at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and since 2017 has been the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Her astronomy research focused primarily on dust disks around single and binary white dwarf systems. However, more recently, she has been dedicated to creating more inclusive environments for LGBT+ individuals in STEM higher education, and has received 4 National Science Foundation grants to accomplish this in the geosciences, and in 2013 received the NASA Equal Employment Opportunity Medal. Whew. So, thank you so much for being
here
with us, Carolyn.
You're welcome.
And so we can dive right into some questions. So first off, can you just tell us a little bit about your science, and then also what you're working on now with all of the equity, diversity, and inclusion stuff, and also where you identify on the LGBT+ spectrum?
Sure. I identify as gay, lesbian, or queer, kind of somewhere in there. It doesn't really matter to me what words we use, to be honest. In terms of my science, so my PhD was actually looking at binary stars and looking at the evolution of binary stars, and I was lucky enough to work with a guy who now works at Warwick, Tom Marsh. He was my advisor, and he and Vic Dillon built a camera, high-speed camera called UltraCam, and we used that to actually measure, literally see the evolution of binary stars. It was really quite astonishing. We used transit timings to see how those binary stars were evolving, and it was incredibly cool. And then I ended up moving out to California. So I did an internship actually in California during my PhD, and ended up moving back out there for a job after I finished my degree. And so worked with Don Horde out there, working on white dwarfs, dust disks, a little bit more on binary stars, some on brown dwarfs, all kinds of things that we ended up working on out there. It was very, very cool. So yeah, that's basically what I did for my career. Mostly using Spitzer. Fortunately, with working there, I got to know the telescope very, very well, and so knew how to best deploy it for the science that we wanted to do. And then, as you said, I fortunately managed to get a staff scientist position after my first postdoc working there, supporting other astronomers using Spitzer. And I loved it. I really did. I really, really enjoyed the work that I was doing there. And I didn't enjoy research that much. And so I decided that I did not want to make research my career. The things that other people were doing, like reading papers when they went to bed at night, it was the last thing I wanted to do. I did not want to do that in my spare time. And so the papers that I was reading in the evenings were actually about education and equity and inclusion. And so I started to really get interested in that. And I went and did my master's in education part-time while I was working at Spitzer. And so that was a really interesting experience because there was a very strong social justice component in that master's program. It was a Claremont Graduate University, and they had this very strong social justice component. And so I learned about things that made me very angry, that I hadn't been exposed to before. At the same time, I was also volunteering for the Trevor Project, doing suicide prevention workshops for LGBT youth. And yeah, just all this stuff kind of came together to me, knowing that I didn't want to do science for the rest of my career, but I really like working with scientists. And so I didn't want to move out of science completely. I think scientists are a fascinating bunch. I really love the way that we all think and the way that we all interact and the way we're all curious about the world. And I truly believe that that curiosity can help us get better at diversity and inclusion because we're naturally curious people, right? So when I had the opportunity to move out to Boulder, Colorado, I applied for the job out here for the director of diversity, education, and outreach, which is actually 3 different jobs. I mean, there's no way you can do all those jobs in one. It's a huge job to do. So moved out here, and then our new president. So we have this system at UCAR and NCAR where UCAR is the management entity who manages NCAR, which is the science center, right? And so I ended up moving it to UCAR, kind of over the road, as it were. And at UCAR, I was then the chief diversity officer because the president created this Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And that's basically where I landed. And really, my job now is, we just created a strategic plan actually of how we're going to tackle this, but it's thinking about how do we diversify our workforce and basically make it representative of the population. How do we think about organizational culture and inclusive cultures? Because the last thing we want to do is bring folks from diverse backgrounds into an organization that's not prepared to then be inclusive. That's not helpful to anybody, and it's very damaging to people who are from those different backgrounds. And then how do we actually incorporate and integrate diversity and inclusion into the science that we do? So are we thinking differently about our science? And a lot of the work we're doing is with Indigenous populations. And so we actually have an entire program working with Indigenous folks, and which was co-created with Indigenous groups. So really thinking about how we can change the way we think about our science to incorporate a lot of different ways of thinking. And so, yeah, that's all the things that I'm trying to figure out right now, as well as measuring success with all of it. And then it's always the measuring how well are we doing that's the challenge. So, yeah, it's basically where I'm at.
That's really interesting, and also that work sounds so important. I think in some of my teaching statements, I've written about how the entire curriculum is kind of whitewashed, and
Absolutely.
like all the scientific history is written by men, right? So it's completely missed out things like Indigenous people. So that's really, really important to diversify and bring those opinions and ways of thinking and thinking outside the box into the scientific narrative.
And thinking how to do that without being extractive as well, because we've now seen this shift towards Western scientists thinking, oh yeah, Indigenous people have really important knowledge that we need to get to do our science. It's like, no, you're missing the point. Right? We need to be co-creating these spaces and working together with Indigenous folks, because apart from anything else, where I work now is not astronomy. The work that we do is climate change primarily and severe weather. And so when we're thinking about those things, Indigenous folks, first of all, have been on the front lines of all this stuff since white people pushed them onto reservations and took away all their resources, right? Indigenous people are the experts in resource management because they've had to be, for tens to hundreds of years, right? And so, they know better than the rest of us how to do that resource management. And they're also on the front lines of the climate change. And so the places that they were pushed to have fewest resources are, very susceptible to rising sea levels, to wildfires, to droughts, to all this stuff. And so they end up experiencing this stuff first. And so if we are not working closely with them to co-create things and to really concentrate on the things that they need us to concentrate on, all of us to concentrate on, then we're missing the boat, right? And so we got to work with people who have that local knowledge and who have that Indigenous and long knowledge. And that goes for all other kinds of populations as well. You think about the folks who are going to be impacted first by climate change is people of color. Is women in many cases. And so thinking about how we work with those local knowledge experts from a place of true collaboration, not from this deficit model of we're the scientists, we know best, and therefore we can bring science to you and solve all the problems. That's not how it works, right? We've got to work together. So yeah, it's tricky getting scientists to understand that sometimes.
Yeah, I can imagine. Oh, thank you for that really, really nice summary there. I guess we have some more questions to ask. I don't know, Jodie, if you want to jump in.
Sure, absolutely. So, okay, so next question is what do you think are some of the main problems that lesbian astronomers, but maybe just scientists in general, face? You know, based on your experiences, or even just the work that you've been doing with them.
It's a really hard question to answer because it depends where you are in the country. You know, I don't know what the situation is right now in Kentucky, right, or in Oklahoma, or in places where there's a much more conservative feel. I can tell you that here in Boulder, I mean, I know for a fact because of the climate survey that we did here at UCAR that LGBTQ people at UCAR are generally very happy, happier than women in general, happier than people of color in general. We don't see much of a difference between the well-being of queer folks at UCAR compared to straight white men, actually. So that's the good news. The bad news is that's not replicated across the rest of the country. I think that we definitely face a lot of microaggressions. I mean, personally, I face a lot of microaggressions. How much of that is due to my sexual orientation versus my gender expression, I really couldn't tell you, right? And so I think all of that feeds in. I know from the research that I've done, it's fascinating actually, the research that I've been doing to think about environments for queer folks, is a lot of people face outright discrimination. It's not that common in more liberal places. What folks face in liberal places is the microaggressions. They face the just the small slights or the lack of thought, right? And so when people ask, oh, are you married? Who's your husband? Kind of thing, where before without asking who's your spouse. And so things like that, people end up getting those micro invalidations. Beyond that, I think actually a lot of it is to do with the wider environment we find ourselves in. And it's just a lack of awareness. And the reason I say that is, I was in California when Prop 8 was happening in 2008. And that was a really quite a defining experience for me. I was surrounded by astronomers during the 2008 election, which was when Prop 8 was on the ballot. And I vividly remember sitting in my home with a whole bunch of other people watching the election results. And everybody else was just over the moon about Obama's election. And I was really happy about that. And at the same time, I was watching those results trickle in of the polling for the Prop 8. And I saw it was going the wrong way. And so I was surrounded by all these people who were just jubilant, drinking, celebrating. And I was sat there on the floor just wanting to cry because I saw the way this was going, right? And everybody else, fortunately, realized this was what was going on and they left. So I didn't have to sit there while everyone else was celebrating. But then kind of the flip side happened when the court decision came down from the Supreme Court about marriage equality. And I sat in bed that morning and I heard that come through and I was like, holy crap, this is awesome. It's happened. This is amazing. I immediately called my ex-girlfriend. I was like, can you believe this? We both cried on the phone together, all this stuff. And then I went into work and nothing. It was like nobody had realized it had happened. And it felt so incredibly lonely. And it just felt like this just desert almost of understanding. Nobody popped their head in to say congratulations. Nobody realized it was happening. And I was there ready to break out the champagne, just nothing. And I think it's things like that when folks around you are completely unaware of what is going on in your world. It can be a very, very isolating feeling. And that has just stuck with me. Obviously for quite a long time because it's now 2020. this was quite a long time ago. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's spot on. Spot on. I think you had mentioned something about the microaggressions, and I think, I'm curious about your experience. Is you're referring to what you experienced in Boulder, which I think we generally associate as a pretty liberal town, or is it specific to your workplace? And I think particularly with scientists, we often feel like, we're kind of a little more enlightened, and that almost kind of gives people a bit of license to say ignorant things. Maybe you see what I'm getting at. Well, I wonder what your experience is with that.
I think that it's very rare that I hear the overt comments anymore. I think that, like I said, what I get is the microaggressions, and it comes from surprising places sometimes. I remember in Pasadena, I was sat with a group of folks I consider pretty close friends, and we were all astronomers, and we were sat there and we were discussing something that had happened with two girls on a sports team, had been thrown off the sports team because they'd been found kissing. On a sports trip, right? And it was pretty obvious that this was a homophobic thing that had happened. Because had these girls been kissing anybody else, it wouldn't have been an issue, right? They wouldn't have been thrown off the sports team. So basically, we were all kind of sat there discussing it, and this guy just suddenly piped up, who I thought was completely on board with the whole gay thing. Yeah, but let's face it, they did bring disrepute to their team, and I was like, holy crap, what just happened? You know. And it's fascinating when stuff like that happens, when it happens from your inner circle, because those are the folks that you've put your guard down against, And I always say that, for a longest time, I felt like I was walking around. I put my armor on in the morning and I walked around with my armor on. And so anybody who says stupid stuff, it just kind of pinged off me. It's like, whatever, I don't care. This is your problem, not mine. But in those situations where these are close friends and you've put your armor down just for that little while and someone then says something, that's the point where it goes right in, right? It hits you really hard. And those are the moments I remember. I'm sure there were plenty more microaggressions that came my way, but I mostly brushed them off, except for when they happen from people who are close to you. I think what's interesting at UCAR is, again, we don't have many overt things, but people have said things. Someone said about me, I forget what I was giving a talk about. I think it might have been about trans identity, actually. And we walked out of that meeting, and it was a very senior director level person. And I didn't know about this until my admin told me. And she said, that director just said, I really, really respect her abilities, professional abilities. I just don't agree with her lifestyle. And it's like, what the heck has my, lifestyle, in scare quotes, got to do with any of this? It's just completely irrelevant. But it made me realize that, people are actually thinking about that when they see me and when they think about me. And of course, I look very stereotypically gay, right? People assume that I'm gay when they see me. But it's been fascinating how this has popped up every now and again, because one of the biggest criticisms my office gets is that we prioritize the needs of LGBT people, which is fascinating to me, because I can tell you right now, we have not deliberately, apart from all gender restrooms, we've not actually deliberately done anything to help LGBT folks at our organization, because the culture survey said that we're generally doing okay. And so while we talk about general diversity and inclusion, and actually we have been working on some stuff around trans folks, we really have, but we've not been talking about sexual orientation very much. We've been talking about race primarily and gender. But all people see when they see my office is all this stuff we've been supposedly doing, for me to be self-serving. It's like we genuinely haven't. It hasn't been a thing. And so that kind of thing is fascinating to me as well. The perceptions that people have based on my identity, even though it's not actually based in reality, it's really quite amazing. And these little things pop up. We talked about creating a safe zone program at UCAR, and there was a lot of backlash against that, because conservative folks at UCAR felt like they were going to get discriminated against if they didn't go through the training and display a sticker on their door. I'm like, wow, that is a fascinating take on that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, what you just said, I think, raises sort of an interesting question about just who are the mouthpieces, right? I mean, if you have someone from a underrepresented group that is leading these diversity efforts, do they kind of get, discounted, I guess, by virtue of the fact that they're kind of self-advocating, whether it's, you had someone that's doing this advocacy, but they're not part of that group. If they're being listened to, and yet those are the people that don't have those direct experiences and all of these sorts of things, that's troubling.
It happens all the time, Alex. It does, and I really work quite hard to get my colleagues to talk about queer issues because of that. And also, it's a place where allies can really step in. And it's a huge, important part for allyship, not only for the queer community, but also for the communities of colour. We're working right now, we've got some issues around gender at UCAR, which is typical of every other place. But we're working right now on male allyship training. Right? We're not calling it training, we're calling it male allyship conversations. But it's about raising awareness amongst male allies about what gender discrimination looks like, and thinking about how they can then help without being male saviors. And so it's a delicate balance, right? And then also a lot of the diversity and inclusion training we do at UCAR is focused around helping white folks figure out how they can be better allies to folks of color. And so we really do try and build up the allies while also making sure we stay accountable to the communities we're trying to make life better for.
Nice, that's really important work. Really important work. So you've touched briefly there on, how people perceive you, and then that kind of almost impacts their judgment of the work that you're doing, right? It's all,
yes.
Like you said, they see it as you serving yourself somehow, which is obviously not the case.
Right.
So one question I guess that leads on from that really is could you tell us a little bit more about your coming out experience in the workplace?
Sure.
Do you fear it affects you professionally, this sort of thing?
I moved countries to come out. So I didn't come out until I moved to the States when I was 24, I think I was. So that 6-month internship that I did was not only important for me professionally, but also very important for me personally, because that's the point at which I got to explore that identity. I don't believe I ever got overtly discriminated against because of my sexual orientation. I got treated very, very well at IPAC. They're very, very queer friendly there. It's interesting that not everybody there is out, and I think that was interesting. I don't know if they are now. They weren't when I was there. And so I did do quite a lot of advocacy there for getting people at IPAC through safe zone training to try and make a safer environment for people to come out. But I always felt very comfortable there. I only heard 1 or 2 ignorant comments there. It wasn't pervasive. Here at UCAR, I came here as a diversity officer, right? I came here as a director for diversity education and outreach, and so I outed myself in my job interviews. I was like, yeah, this is my identity. This is what I've been doing. I'm queer. This is how I'm gonna bring, my understanding of diversity to this organization. So it was never an issue here either. I was always out. Yeah. So to be honest, I never had a thing.
Arguably in your current post, I suppose it's been a great help because you have this additional perspective that you wouldn't have if you were a straight white woman, right? So.
Oh, absolutely. I think it would be very difficult to do this job if I wasn't minoritized in some way beyond being a woman. Absolutely. Yeah. And certainly I get a lot of suspicion because I'm a white woman doing this work, right? Which is entirely reasonable. I totally get why people have suspicions around that. And a lot of the work I do is to try and build those relationships early, to make it, to hopefully demonstrate that I at least know something of what I'm talking about. I would never claim to be an expert. I don't think any of us can be. But yeah.
It's really interesting what you mentioned about your efforts there, and then people thinking that and saying that we're focusing too much on LGBT issues. It makes me wonder about the fact that maybe inclusion efforts, right? As we see them now in many places and institutes, they focus on race and gender most of the time, and LGBT issues seem to be like excluded from inclusion efforts, right? It's as if it's almost as if it is seen as an afterthought, right?
Yes.
And we can see that there is no institution advocating for having more LGBT folks, right? We see institutes advocating for having more women, for having more people of color, but I haven't seen any place saying, "No, we need more gay people in the staff." Right, so it seems almost like the best that we can expect is that they are okay with us, right? Be here, that's fine that you're gay, but don't bring it up too much.
I think a lot of that, though, is to do with the way that our funding agencies measure diversity and inclusion. So LGBT identities are not included in the definition of diversity that we have to report to the federal government and that we have to report to our funding institutions. So we have to report race and gender, right? And the focus has been from them. What I'm getting told by the NSF, for example, is they really want to see an increase in the number of people of color and women at our organization. They didn't even mention LGBT people, right? It's me that has to say, and queer people, you know, I have to interject that. And let me be clear, you know, LGBT people are absolutely in our target audience at UCOT, 100%. And in fact, we're thinking right now about a campaign towards transgender folks, particularly software engineers, because we really need more gender diversity in our software engineering. And trans folks would bring amazing, you know, gender diversity to that field. So, you know, I think a lot of it is the way that diversity is measured by the people that we have to report to. And I think also that queer issues, I'm putting that in scare quotes as well, queer issues are a bit of a political football now as well. And so it ends up being difficult, let's put it that way, challenging, should we say, to balance ensuring inclusion for queer folks and ensuring that conservatives in an organization still feel included and welcome. And that is a very real thing, right? I don't want anybody at our organization to feel like they're excluded, no matter what their, you know, identities, no matter what their political affiliations. And it is important that we ensure that we uphold people's identities as welcome. Everybody has to be welcome, and so you don't get to come in as a conservative and say that gay people aren't welcome, right? That's not allowed. You also don't get to come in and say that conservative people aren't welcome. We can say that some conservative views are not welcome. We don't get to say that conservative people are not welcome. And so it's balancing all these things, right? It's a very, very difficult balance to get. And it's a tightrope that we walk every single day in thinking about how to maximize inclusion at our organization, especially with some early. Go.
Sorry, just that touches on kind of a unique challenge of the LGBT plus experience. That obviously there's a variety of challenges that are faced by any number of underrepresented groups, but no one can really come out and say, "Well, I have a moral objection to you being a woman," or "I have a moral objection to you being from a different part of the world." Whereas people do still kind of have that liberty to say, "Well, I just don't, as you said, agree with your lifestyle." And
that's exactly it.
To what extent are we infringing on their rights to believe that by saying, that kind of attitude is not welcome? It's really
and they can believe that all they want. We are not legislating people's beliefs, but they're not allowed to bring it into the workplace because UCI is a fully LGBT affirming workplace, and so you don't get to come into UCI and say, you should not have rights. That's not how this works, But we can't control what people believe, and it is very real. I see a lot of disdain that liberals have for conservatives. I understand a lot of it, and the discourse is less than respectful a lot of the time. And so, like I said, out of work, you can say what the heck you like. I don't care. When you're in a work environment, you got to respect each other. Doesn't mean you have to respect each other's views, but you got to respect each other as people. So again, that's a huge challenge, right? Because we hear, of liberals literally in meetings dismissing beer-swilling, Trump-loving conservatives, right? And actually, there may be some conservatives in that room who feel incredibly dismissed by this, especially if they didn't vote for Trump, right? And so you end up with this problem where they're feeling very dismissed and like they can't let people know about their political identity. And so they end up, hiding things about themselves. And so, like I said, but at the same time, we've got to make sure that queer people feel safe. So.
Yeah, there's a fascinating parallel there in the sense that LGBT folks are often sort of a hidden minority, right? I mean, some people, as you say, can be more obvious. I'm obviously gay or something like that, but many are not.
Yes.
And similarly, we particularly in the academic environment, operate routinely as though, well, everyone in this room is obviously a liberal, obviously agrees with me about Trump or that kind of thing. Yeah.
And I can tell you that's genuinely not true. I mean, the culture survey that we did actually looked at political affiliation, and we know that while 40% of our organisation is liberal, the rest are a mix, and we actually have, like, I think it's 15-20% of folks who identify as conservatives. So yeah, I mean, it is. We cannot assume that everybody in the room that agrees with us ever.
I think that's very interesting, because in the UK we have a concept of a shy Tory. So, for example, I can't think of a single scientist who has ever told me that they've voted Conservative. They just wouldn't, because in many ways it would be potentially, whether people mean it or not, it could be damaging to their career in some way, because people would think differently of them and would maybe think, I'm not sure I want to work with this person. So I can see if people lean Conservative, they would be reluctant to admit it, I think.
Absolutely, and that doesn't help when we're trying to shift hearts and minds, right?
No, it doesn't, right? You can't have a shift of hearts and mind based on fear of reprisal. It doesn't work.
Absolutely. We've got to open up genuine lines of communication, and if we're not being genuine in that communication, then we don't get to help shift people's viewpoints. So it's definitely, it's self-serving to be as inclusive as possible. Let's say that.
That's difficult, right? How do we build a bridge with someone who claims to have a moral? I mean, as Alex mentioned, right? I mean, like has. Well, I'm trying to find the word here, right? Who looks
at moral objection to your existence.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
So
I completely agree.
Yeah, I guess it touches the point that sure. I mean, like you can think that. I mean, like you can believe in rocks if you want to. Just don't throw them at me, right?
Right. And that's absolutely a major piece. I think the piece where the parallel breaks down here is in comfort versus safety, right? Queer people are genuinely afraid for their safety. Conservatives are worried about their comfort, right?
Yes,
and that's really where that breaks down.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I feel like we've covered an awful lot already. Okay, let's think of a few more questions. I think this is a good one. So a study suggests that often gay women think that their gender is more of a barrier to success at work than their sexual orientation. What do you think about this? What would you say is more hurting, gender or orientation?
I think that I've experienced more gender discrimination than I have homophobia. I think what's really interesting is the research around this in terms of who people see as competent. There's some fascinating research that shows that gay men are seen as less competent than straight men, but queer women are seen as more competent than straight women. And that totally rolls into gender expectations, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's that piece that the masculinity, which is completely does not, describe all gay men and all queer women. It's ridiculous. But that feeling that masculinity stereotypically is more to do with science. So even when we get that, issues around sexual orientation, I think it's rooted in gender for that piece about competency. So I would agree that gender tends to be a much bigger thing in general, and I wouldn't want to say that for everybody, because I do believe that there are parts of the country where being queer is so difficult that presumably does rise to a higher level. It's all about salience, right? Which is the most salient part of my identity right now. And I think for a lot of people, the queerness would rise to the top in that, depending on the political orientation.
I think that's a really interesting point as well. I can't remember if I did it last year or the year before, but I did a display on LGBT scientists, and I got responses from people being like, I want to be part of this display, but I'm in a country where it's illegal to be gay. And so I put them up as like, anonymous sort of shadow profiles with false names, and it was kind of sad having these scientists contact me through Twitter saying, I want to be part of this display, but
I can't be who
and I think
I am,
for those scientists, right, their sexuality is far more damaging than their gender identity.
Right.
Okay. So I guess something else that I think maybe can be quite positive is could you tell us about role models? Did you have any more senior queer scientists to look up to when you were a student or a postdoc? And if yes, how did that help? And if not, how did you think it would have helped?
Not as a student, yes, as a postdoc. I think it very much helped. Actually, that's not true. Sorry. At Spitzer, there was a queer scientist who I met during my internship, and she was pretty instrumental in me finally coming out. I think what she showed me is a different way of being queer. It's interesting because I didn't come out till I was 24 because I did not because I had any like repressed stuff. I just didn't realize I was gay. And I think one of the reasons I didn't realize I was gay is because all the stereotypes that I saw around, gay folks were just not me. I didn't want to go out and party until 4 a.m. I didn't drink. I didn't do drugs. I didn't do all these things that gay people supposedly did. And so I'm like, well, I can't be gay because I don't want to do that, right? And so it was a complete lack of role models, right? And so for the longest time,
I'm just laughing at all the boxes you ticked.
Right.
Well, I only realized I was gay when I was like, oh yeah, I'm a party animal.
So right. But yeah, I mean, I knew that I didn't feel the same way about boys as everybody else when I was a teenager, but I also just thought I was broken. It didn't occur to me that I was gay, right? I just thought that this was not something I was going to experience in my life, is being with another human being, which was a horrible thing to think as a teenager. Now I think about it, didn't particularly bother me at the time, funnily enough. I just kind of threw myself into my schooling, which is something that we see a lot in the research that queer people do as well. We find validation in our work and become really invested in our work and our schooling and become high achievers because that's something we know we can control and that we have, we're good at. But yeah, the role modeling thing, like I said, didn't really happen until I was out in the States. And the role models that I had until then were, in the media, which weren't particularly positive. So yeah, I think it was quite instrumental with me having people who actually came face to face with who were gay and who were planning a family and with a partner, and yeah. Yeah, I wish more of that had happened.
Think even just yeah, I think even just knowing somebody who was like a out and living a happy life, like that can make such a difference to people. Like I didn't I didn't have that growing up, and it's kind of like, oh, what's wrong with me, so just even having one person who would have gone, it's okay, it's normal, 5% of the population like you would have been like,
right.
Oh, good,
right, phew.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And it seems especially important whenever you're in a science or like in astronomy to see someone in that type of position that has overcome all those obstacles and has also done what you're trying to do, and so I think that's inspiring too.
Definitely.
Well, and I think that's why it's so important for people to be out when it's safe for people to be out, and I talk about my sexual orientation. I out myself to all the students who come through UCAR because I want them to have that positive role model. I talk about my kid, I mean, my son is 11 months old. He's napping right now, thank goodness. But, he's 11 months old, and I absolutely talk about him. It's perfectly possible to be queer and have this awesome kid and be completely in love with him and have this great life and everything to be okay and to be happy and find community, and that's really what I want everyone to know. Yeah.
Nice, really nice. I guess, Jodie, would you like to ask maybe a couple more questions?
Yeah, of course. So I think my next question here is, for some women, being gay is a cause for concern in the workplace, and so some say that they're unsure how to turn their sexual orientation into a positive aspect of their work persona. Bringing it in to a part of your work ethic that's a good and positive thing that other people respect. And so, I guess, what is your view on this?
I think every way that we bring difference into a workplace is so valuable. Every way that we can bring just something that's not what is already there. We know that diversity brings this amazing increase in innovation, in creativity, in ways that we're thinking about things. And there's a lot of talk in the research literature right now about queering academia. And they don't just mean getting more gay people into academia. They mean changing the way that we actually do research to think about different ways of coming at it. And it's so important when we do that, to just bring all those aspects of ourselves. And it's not just queer issues, right? It's race, it's gender, it's disabilities, it's all those things that help us think in different ways. It's such a bonus for us, because we've been taught to think outside the box that society is trying to put us in, right? And so we often get taught in very similar ways in universities. And if we never think outside that box, and we never bring a different way of thinking in, we're not going to, bring the full stuff of what we can possibly bring to our work. I don't know how much of that you got, because I froze. But
hopefully we get all.
I think I got maybe about 70%.
Yeah, fortunately, hopefully the audio, we're recording at home, so the audio will all come through eventually. Yeah.
It'll come through fine.
Totally.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
So Jodie, maybe one more question from Jodie, and then one more from me, and then if anyone has any more.
Sure. So I'm actually particularly interested in your answer to this, being a young queer scientist. So do you have any advice for more junior lesbian astronomers that are starting their career?
Find a place where you can be yourself. I mean, that's really the only advice I can give, to be honest. It's easy for me to say because I managed to find those places and wasn't scrambling for work. And so I know that it's not something that everyone can always do. But I think that so much of you gets repressed and suppressed and oppressed when you can't be your full self. And I know that I would not have been as good at my job, any of my jobs, as I am if I'd had to be second guessing whether I could be out or not, and having to spend the mental energy trying to think about that. And so, we have to be, in order to succeed in science, we have to be really good, right? It's really hard to continue to do a science career if we're not on our best game. And if we are spending mental energy trying to hide parts of ourselves from other people, we're never going to do our best. And frankly, we deserve to have that life where we can be our best. I mean, it's one of the great joys of life, being good at our jobs, right? And being good at what we do and being good at things we love and care about. And if we can't do that because, like I said, we're trying to, keep things hidden, it's not helpful. And, finding a place that is going to value you because of your queerness, not in spite of it, is going to be such a different place to work. Such a joyous place to work in many ways, And
I think that's one of the things I've been starting to realize is that, for a while I thought that I needed to hide who I was and how much I was out in the workplace and to my advisors and colleagues. And I think what you're saying is right. I mean, I started to come to the point where I realized that if people don't want to work with me or hire me because of who I am, then I don't know that I want to work with them or for them.
Right. And there's a lot of privilege in that, though, right? Because some people don't have that privilege of making that decision. But I think it is an important factor for sure.
Can you repeat that? Actually, I think our sound cut out a bit.
Yeah, no problem. I said that there's a lot of privilege in that, though, right? A lot of people don't have that choice, and so it's absolutely a factor. If you can make it happen, go for it. But I think it's also something that we can't demand that everybody do because of the amount of privilege that's looped into that.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. That's a great point.
Yeah. You have to take, everything into account. Like, am I currently safe right now? Like, do I have money to back me up if I lose my job?
Exactly.
I think it's great to do if you can. I've always had a brass neck, so I kind of don't really care, but not everyone's like that, right? And, again,
right.
I'm speaking from a position of privilege as a white woman where I'm safe and reasonably well. So.
Right.
Great.
That was one of your other questions, actually, that you had in there that I did.
Oh, sorry.
I did want to address one thing that you brought up. And one of the questions that you sent to me beforehand was whether you think there is this like gap between straight women and queer women.
Ah, yes. Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was a really interesting question because I think there is a gap between. I don't think it's that simple. It's not that gap that's the important part. I think it's the gap between people who only want to fight for rights for them versus people who are willing to fight for rights for other people as well. I think that in there is the gap. That's the schism that happens. And I will say it's not just around queer issues. I think it's important that as a queer community, we think about how we are also doing that around race, right? You know, when we talk about queer issues, are we also thinking about queer people of color, queer and trans people of color, right? Are we also thinking about queer people with disabilities? Are we as willing to fight for them as we are for things that are important to us? And so I think that very quickly when you start to think about this, you realize that unless your diversity work is intersectional, you're missing the point. And it's impossible to separate out these particular groups' issues from everybody's issues, right? Because there are always people who are going to have those intersectional identities. And so, you know, I would encourage us all, as we think about what queer issues are, to think about how they intersect with other identities and make sure that we're not doing the same thing that a lot of white, cis, straight women do to us. You know, just let's make sure that all of our work is inclusionary.
Yeah, intersectionality in, you know, EDI issues is so important, and I think as well it's, you know, important to have people's viewpoints from, you know, especially from the, you know, people of color, from disabled people as well, because, you know, so often you can be, you know, well-meaning, and then you've put it wrong because actually you don't spend your life in a wheelchair, or you don't, you know, walk around as a person of color in a predominantly white country. You know, and it's important that those voices are heard and that you're not misstepping even if you mean well. And that's something that people who often work in EDI, I think, are kind of, you know, I'm not racist, I'm not, you know, I don't have any problems with disabled people. It's like, not saying that you are racist or that you have problems, but you have like internalized viewpoints that maybe you haven't thought about, and trying to get people who mean well to address these things can be tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. And we even see it within the community, queer community. You know, we see gay and folks of sexual minorities who are not thinking about folks who are gender minorities. You know, that lack of inclusion of trans folks is a really important part. You know, quite often trans folks will go to what they think are queer affirming spaces, and they're super affirming of gay and lesbian and bisexual people, and not at all of trans folks. So, you know, thinking about that and how we do even the work within our own community is a really important piece.
Absolutely. Okay. Does anybody have any more final points?
Oh, I've been thinking about what you said about, you know, the gender discrimination, like how gay men are seen as less competent, but gay women are seen as more competent, and that's how that's completely rooted in gender, right? It's as if being gay for men saps male privilege, and being a gay woman actually gives male privilege. You know, it's a crazy notion, right? But it's I think that if we go and, you know, like talk about it more, it will be one whole hour. So maybe that's something to talk about in the next episode.
Yeah. I'm gonna go and enjoy my newfound male privilege anyway. All right. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Carolyn.
You're more than welcome.
Yeah, really fabulous. I think your work especially gives us so much unique insight. I mean, you know, we've talked to folks so far who obviously can tell us a lot about their own personal experience, but your work along all of these different lines is really just incredibly educational for all of us, I think. So I really appreciate it.
And to have all of this knowledge in one person is really something quite special. I really enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you.
No, thank you very much indeed. I appreciate the chance to talk to you. It's been fun. Alex, I'll send you this recording then.
That's right. Yeah.
As soon as we're done here.
That'll be good. Yeah, so we'll send up follow-up emails. So Just want to thank our viewers really quickly for joining us for this episode of Out in Space. I'm Alex once again, and maybe everybody else will just quickly identify themselves, and that'll be it.
I'm
Jody.
Okay, I think we spoke at the same time.
That's glad. All right, so this has been another episode of Out in Space, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.